In the previous video, we demonstrated how an HTTP 400 error is displayed when the payload contains an invalid field annotated for validation. However, the default error format is less informative as it does not specify which field is invalid. In this video, we'll show you how to catch useful validation exceptions. First of all, let's recap what Spring3 validation is. Spring3 validation is an essential component of the Spring framework, used to enforce constraints on the properties of Java objects. It ensures that data adheres to specific rules before processing. These are some examples of bean validation annotation. We can add them on DTOs. When these constraints are checked with valid and violated, Spring throws a method argument, not valid exception. Let's look at an example using bean validation. In this case, the error will be caught before the invalid field is processed by the application. Instead of an application crash, we receive an HTTP 400 response, which indicates that there is an issue with the payload. The error format shown is the default in Spring3. If we need to provide more details, such as identifying which field is invalid, we can customize the error response. Some approaches to handling errors include using custom error attributes by extending default error attributes, using a controller-level exception handler, or using a global exception handler with a REST controller advice. Note that these approaches are primarily used for RESTful controllers. Let's begin by assuming there is no custom exception handler in place. In the default bean validation flow, a method argument not valid exception is thrown when the request body validation fails, leading to the default error response being displayed. However, we can customize the error attributes by overriding a method in default error attributes. We can override getError attributes. To include error messages, we can use include message attribute in error attribute options. Additionally, any custom messages can be added to error attributes map data structure. We will show an example. Let's say we have a DTO with a pizza type field annotated with a not null. Here is a sample of the controller. The API accepts the pizza order DTO as input and validates it using the valid annotation. This postman calls the controller with the input pizza type. However, note that pizza type is null, which violates the rule not null. In the bottom window, we see the output from the controller. We can see the message indicating which field violated the rule. Also, we see the custom message we just created. Instead of overriding default error attributes, we can alternatively create an exception handler. Exception handler gives you more control over how exceptions are handled in your Spring Boot application, making it a flexible and clean approach. Note that if, for example, method argument not valid exception is handled in exception handler, Spring no longer call the customer or attribute. There are controller-based and global-based exception handler implementations. Use controller-based exception handler when you want specific error handling behavior limited to a single controller. Use global-based exception handler when you want to handle exceptions consistently across multiple controllers and have a centralized place for exception handling. If any of exception handler is implemented for specific exception, Spring does not call the custom error attributes for that exception. Here is the controller-based exception handler. Exception handler captures exceptions of method argument, not valid exception. For each field error, the field name and the error message are added to the errors map. The handler returns a response entity with the map of field names and error messages. The response is returned with an HTTP status of bad request, HTTP 400. Here is the global-based example. It is very similar to the controller-based exception handler. REST controller advice is used to define a global exception handler for all REST API's controllers in the application. The method is annotated with exception handler to catch exceptions. It extracts the validation errors from the exception using getFieldErrors, iterating through the list of field error objects. The method returns a response entity with the error's map containing field names and error messages. If both controller-based and REST controller advice exception handler exist for the specific exception, only controller-based is called by Spring. Thank you for watching our video. See you soon.